Thank you. Thank you for everybody for coming out today. So yes, the title of this panel presentation is IP Issues, What Really Matters from All Perspectives. And we have a great panel here. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and as they go through their introductions, you're going to see that we have people from all perspectives of due diligence. The acquisition side, investment side, and also from the company side. So I'll just let them start. David, you want to go first?
Perfect. I'm David Beylik. I'm a vice president at Ajax Health. We invest primarily in medical devices. We have a couple dozen portfolio companies across cardiovascular, electrophysiology, a few other therapeutic areas. We like to take a very active role in investments, at a minimum a board seat, but oftentimes taking executive level roles, kind of wrapping our arms around the companies. And most recently we were part of a $1 billion transaction where we acquired Cordis from Cardinal Health. And through that we set up a special $300 million vehicle to invest in cardiovascular technologies for Cordis. So through that, I've kind of had an opportunity to wear a venture investing hat and also the hat of a strategic and a potential acquirer. And we've done everything from incubating technologies from scratch to buying very mature medical device companies to Series A and kind of everything in between. So it's good to be here.
Thank you. I'm Leah Brownlee. I am president and general counsel at Lazurite. We have the first FDA-cleared wireless surgical camera. Also, in my career, I've spent about half of it at Big Law, being a corporate deal lawyer in the life science and venture space, and another 6 years at a publicly traded biotech company.
Hi, I'm Bryan Wahl. I'm the general counsel and head of business development at Tarsus Pharmaceuticals. Tarsus is a publicly traded registrational stage eye care pharmaceutical company with what we hope is going to be the very first FDA-approved treatment for Demodex blepharitis. It's basically mites living in your eyelid. And I'm in charge of all legal and BD activities, including search and evaluation and licensing, out licensing. Prior to that, I was a partner at Knobbe for over 15 years, working with Rabi. And prior to that, background as a physician in internal medicine. Honored to be here today.
Hi, I'm Anthony Williams. I'm a partner at HealthQuest Capital. We're a growth stage investor in healthcare, of course, but we invest across the spectrum. So devices, diagnostics, of course, but healthcare IT and digital health and tech-enabled services. And pretty much anything in healthcare is certainly down the proverbial fairway for us. We've got about $2 billion under management, and we write checks, call it between $20 million on the low end, $6 million on the high end. Like David, we're fairly active in our portfolio companies, take board seats pretty much 100% of the time as well. Also happy to be here.
Hi, everybody. My name is Matthew Miessau, and I'm a senior associate with Epidarex Capital. Epidarex is an early-stage life science venture firm based in the US and the UK. We're company builders. We invest in seed and Series A opportunities in the medical device and therapeutic space. We like to work with innovators and entrepreneurs and help to license technologies out of the university setting. And from an IP perspective, we're comfortable investing before companies have issued IP when things are still in filing. So thanks so much for having me.
Cool. Great. So the first question, I'm going to start with Matthew, David, and Anthony. From an acquirer and investor perspective, how important is IP due diligence? And if I had a, every deal is a little different, but what are your pet peeves? What do you consider kind of the most important things in your kind of career when you look at IP due diligence? Start with you, Anthony.
Yeah, so, this is MedTech conference, right? So you talk about the world of MedTech. IP is incredibly important, right? As a commercial stage investor, really bad outcome for us, lead a big round in a company, find out they can't sell the product that they pitched to us, or somebody else can do exactly the same thing. So it's important to us fundamentally. I mean, it is a critical diligence point. In terms of most important issue, there are several. But if I had to pick one, I would say is just getting IP ownership right. It's not that hard to do, that it is astounding when companies don't get it right. But assignment of inventions language in your employment agreements, the equivalent language in your consulting agreements, is fundamentally blocking and tackling. But if you don't get those things right, if you kind of think about the evolution of a company, and employees leave and consultants finish their engagements and move on, it's almost impossible to clean that up after the fact. And it'll impair value down the road almost certainly if you don't get it right.
David?
So I would agree mostly with Anthony, but maybe with one distinction that might be a little bit contrarian. I think we do a lot of investing in the cardiovascular space, a lot of PMA projects, and I think in our opinion, the freedom to operate is incredibly, incredibly important. The last thing you want is an injunction saying you can't commercialize your product at the end of that road. So we place a lot of weight on FTO. But in terms of assessing the offensive coverage of the company's claims, I think from our perspective, it doesn't really matter, to be totally honest. I think the reason for that is there's so many other sources of a competitive moat with those types of technologies. The technical execution, the clinical data, the regulatory approval, even things like having robust manufacturing processes, being able to deliver low COGS and attractive margins at scale, avoiding recalls, all of those things are so difficult that I think in our view, if a company can get those things right, it doesn't matter if another company could, quote, copy their IP, because their practical ability to do that is going to be very, very low likelihood or very delayed, at which point the company might have, a number 1 or a number 2 position in the market. So I think for us, it's almost all about FTO in terms of looking at the offensive coverage. What we care most about is that they have a good IP lawyer, someone like Rabi, who's has a seat at the table, pursuing the right claims, making them as broad as they can reasonably be given the category. And if they have the right IP team around it, we kind of trust them that you'll get the best claims you can get. They're not going to be a huge deal at the end of the day. But the FTO, again, is like live or die for us, so very important.
And just real quick, I'll turn it over. Just FTO for the audience, if you're not into the lingo, freedom to operate, or basically, are you worried about a third party patent and that you might be infringing that patent? So, turn over to you.
And agree with what's been said so far. To add to it, for us, IP diligence, or IP and obviously IP diligence, are absolutely critical. They help us to understand the defendable, unique differentiators of a technology and then how that fits into the marketplace and competitive landscape. And further to that, the novelty really for us is a big driver. We invest in very early stage technologies that really by definition need to be novel and different in order to success, or to be successful when they eventually get to the market or in the hands of a possible acquirer. So for us, novelty is really big.
Cool. All right, for Leah and Bryan, you've kind of taken the company perspective. Can you talk to us about, how important or how long it takes you to kind of prepare a company for IP due diligence? What are you really concerned about when you're kind of tasked as the person to get the company ready for an IP due diligence in that process? So, go Leah first, or?
Yeah, happy to. So we have a fairly large IP portfolio for our stage of the company. So we are early commercialization, and we have 36 issued patents worldwide, and numerous more pending, as well as trademarks and domain names and other things. So preparing the company has happened from day one, which was like 7 years ago. And that is hiring people with the right technical expertise, not just the right law firm. So it's getting that right, we have an optical product, so that person with the right optical expertise within the law firm, and we've moved along with our lawyer to multiple firms. So that's number one. In later stage, and I came into the company about 2.5 years ago, one of the very first things I did was a broad worldwide trademark search. And that resulted in changing the company's name. And so preparing for launching a product on a different type of IP that we don't always talk about, having the wrong name can invite a lawsuit. And so preparing for IP due diligence in that way meant an entire process.
Now, as Leah mentioned, that you want to do it on a continuous basis, but well ahead of any financing or any other sort of diligence event as you can. So keeping your data rooms up to date. You mentioned you want to make sure your employment agreements and your IP assignment agreements are all signed by the inventors, because sometimes they'll leave the company before you have a chance to do that. So you want to make sure that's up to date. And your patent portfolio, make sure all your counts are right. If you have pending continuations, that's very valuable. And as far as freedom to operate as well, so if you can do regular searching, for example, on the landscape, to make sure that you're up to date on any competitors and any risk there, and that's usually good too, as opposed to having to do a search a week before your term sheet or something like that.
And for David and Matthew, how prepared do you expect a company to be for IP due diligence? Are there any kind of red flags that you've seen in the past that kind of maybe have you lose faith in the company or scare you off early in the process?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. So we work a lot with university spin-outs and help to bring things out of the university setting. So we appreciate that filings done in the university setting might be different from those, the patent process or strategy for a startup or a growth stage company. So we appreciate that. And as a result, we help to really put a path in place, a strong patent strategy in place as a part of our investment. And for companies, it's absolutely crucial, as David and others have already mentioned, to really work with the right kind of patent counsel early on. And so again, as being an early stage investment group, we're fine with, we understand companies might not work with large firms immediately upon incorporation, but we would expect that a company would move to the right IP counsel as a part of the investment process. And this is something that we assess during our diligence process as well. And not to beat it to death, but working with a strong counsel, as noted, helps to really translate your novel engineering findings and processes here as a device conference to the right kind of strong patent portfolio. And so again, that's absolutely critical. Some red flags could include when companies equate the number of filings with novelty or strength, and it's absolutely not the case. It's quality over quantity. And when companies don't do a strong enough effort or job to really understand the competing landscape of patents around them, and that's where things, of course, blow up during diligence. We can talk about that later as well. So, yeah.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really well said. I agree with everything. I think I would just add, it's a sliding scale depending on if it's a very early stage company. Obviously, our expectations are relaxed. If it's much later stage, gearing towards an acquisition, they have to be a lot more buttoned up. But in general, I would say two things. One is, if it's a scenario where there was some platform technology that was part of the formation story, if it's coming at a university or a lab or something like that, I think the most important thing that they have to have prepared is the very clear chain of title, basically, in terms of any licenses, having it all buttoned up so that they actually own what they think they own. We've seen deals where that turned out not to be the case, and could solve it through documentation, but that makes us very nervous, obviously. And I think the other piece is, not to beat on the FTO drum too much, but I think having a pretty sophisticated awareness of the landscape and what other patents are out there is important for us, not only to assure us that they have the freedom to operate, but also, I think indirectly it helps us assess their strategic thinking. Do they really understand the competitor technologies out there at a level of nuance and sophistication where they've thought about design trade-offs, they've thought about what they can and they can't do, they've thought about how changing this angle or this length or whatever it is might actually impact the customer's perception of the technology and the usability. So I think we spend a lot of time on FTO, but sometimes it's as much strategic and about the product market fit and what the customers think than it is about whether you infringe a particular patent. And we get a lot of comfort when the company knows every patent that's out there, and by extension, every competitor that they're going to have to compete with in the marketplace.
Pitch decks. We talked about this kind of in the pre-call preparation. We're going to see a lot of companies going to be presenting their story, their company. How do you think IP should be presented in a pitch deck? Is it 10 slides, 1 slide? What do you like to see in that? Maybe you're not going to.
Yeah, happy to go first. I think about that pitch deck is the roadmap for the first call, right? So you think about that pitch call, it's going to be, maybe 45 to 60 minutes. We're probably going to skip the IP slide because there's just not enough time. We'll be lucky to get through the deck anyway. I think if you're going to put something in there, if you think it's important to your story or you just want to signal that you're aware that IP is important, I think a slide is sufficient. We're going to get to IP at some point during the sort of ongoing dialogue with the company, but you probably are going to need an entirely separate deck to go over IP, and I'm not sure I would make your pitch deck longer to cover it.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so agreed, be factual, concise, maybe not any, don't add commentary over it of what's great or strong, let the patent speak for themselves, include dates and things. But in addition to that, if you're an early stage company, if you do have an issued patent, that could be a differentiator, so make sure to call that out. And then practically, if on an investor call, investors want to know more, it's a great opportunity to offer to introduce them to IP counsel to really have that conversation. That's how they can be an advocate.
Cool. Any comments? Okay. I'll probably go right back to you, Anthony, because we talked about this. What about some other IP issues like privacy, cybersecurity? My sense is that's becoming a bigger issue nowadays. So it's not just about freedom to operate, patent ownership of IP, but also how are you protecting your customer list and stuff like that?
Yeah, I actually think about them a little bit differently than the way I think about IP, just sort of conceptually, but I think they're also important. I would say, so we're commercial stage, we invest a little bit later. The companies we interact with, privacy rarely an issue, right? These companies sell to hospitals, to health systems, to providers who are very attuned to the risks of privacy just because of the exposure under HIPAA. Cybersecurity a little bit different. When you think about cybersecurity, you've got sort of garden variety cybersecurity. I hate to call it that, but financial fraud and ransomware attacks and things of that nature. Those are important. You need to have a plan. But a lot of companies will have policies and procedures in place that are at least designed to address those. May or may not be effective. Hopefully we'll never find out. But one of the sort of areas that's a little more complex is the world of connected devices, right? Just you sort of imagine the havoc that a hacker could cause if they, for example, got access to a platform that controlled an implantable pacemaker, right? And the risk to the patient's lives. So, as medical device manufacturers, they really need to have robust security there and make sure that just the patient safety is protected. An area that's getting some sort of airplay at the moment is older connected devices, where it's hospitals in the current environment are trying to extend the useful lives of these devices. Many of them want to know that the operating systems can be upgraded, patches can be installed to manage against new and evolving risks. And we know there will be new and evolving risks. You just cannot overestimate the creativity and the malevolence of bad actors. But from a hospital, they really want to know the device is going to work. The patient's going to be safe, the device is going to work as intended. And so manufacturers of medical devices need to be able to say that this device will continue to work as we told you it would. And hospitals we hear that more and more nowadays from hospitals, again, as they're thinking about making a device that was probably designed to last 2 or 3 or 5 years, last 6 or 7 or 8.
Cool.
If I can, just
Sure.
a couple comments. So we have the first wireless camera, and we're launching it right now. So the questions that we get from the IT architecture review consistently are around that. And really a big question is, do we rely on the hospital's Wi-Fi system? Do we rely on Bluetooth for the video from the camera system to make it to the monitor? Because if the Wi-Fi goes down in the middle of surgery, we can't lose the visualization during surgery. Ours stays up, but that's always a gating question. And we've only gone to about a dozen hospitals so far, but it's been consistent and across the board.
For Leah and Bryan, we talked about this before, the idea of licensing in technology or licensing out technology. I think you both have done that successfully, and then I'll turn it over to kind of the other side and how you view kind of licensing in and out. So maybe Bryan, start with you on some examples of successfully licensing out or in IP.
Sure, Rabi. Here at Tarsus, licensing has been extremely valuable to our company. So, for example, our key active pharmaceutical ingredient was actually in-licensed from a veterinary animal health company, and we were able to have some innovative formulations and get exclusivity for all human use. So that's been a great partnership there. And as far as out-licensing, we're able to out-license and have a partnership in China for our drug to bring as many patients as we can around the world. So out-licensing territorially involves some international IP protection, which has some capital requirements associated with that, but it can add significant value, can help you to expand your reach with patients. So I would encourage companies to consider that international IP protection and then consider partnering it so you can also use that non-dilutive financing potentially to go back into your U.S. and other operations in your pipeline.
And from my experience, I have to go one company back, and we had in-licensed technology from Cleveland Clinic that was developed there. And so we had milestones that we had to reach in the development pathway of that technology, but we also had the ability to sub-license without going back to the licensor, which was very critical for the commercialization strategy and going out to other territories around the world to do our licensing activity. And to license out specific indications. We had gone out to China as one of a kind of a fundraising effort to non-dilutively raise additional funds for the company and out-licensed a target that was not on our primary path in the U.S.
Yeah, so maybe from the investor side, what do you think of these licensing agreements? Are they going to be scrutinized a lot, or are they red flags to you, or just kind of part of the business?
Sure, thank you. So again, from the early stage, the majority of our portfolio are university spin out, so licenses from universities really play an absolutely critical role and are heavily scrutinized as part of our diligence process. As noted, we can also help to really move the needle on the licenses if there are key terms that are not favorable for a company. Our goal is to make sure that a license is not overly burdensome to the company and to help them, that wouldn't prevent them from raising additional money or partnering. So we also are thinking about the needs of a potential partner or acquirer down the road as well from that early stage at really company creation. And as a part of our process, just a few things we think about on the IP side really are gaining access to the improvements on the technology that we've licensed, say, from the inventor's lab in the research setting, as well as control of IP processes and prosecution, where we'd like to shift that from the university to, say, patent counsel as soon as possible, really at company creation.
Yeah, so I certainly agree with that. Companies that get spun out of universities, there's just going to be a license, right? There aren't many universities left that'll transfer ownership of the patent, which is fine. So, but you want to be careful when you're negotiating that, make sure that the rights are being granted fit not only with what you're going to do now, but where you think you're going. You think about Wayne Gretzky and skating, where the puck's going to be. You have to think about that in terms of field of use and make sure that you can continue to evolve, because at that stage, of course, companies are going to evolve pretty radically. On licenses out, you do see a fair amount in pharma and biotech, see it a lot less in medtech. And so when we see it, it actually causes us to wonder why. And there may be valid reasons, right? It may be you're licensing rights to it to China because you're never going to go there, and there's non-dilutive funding that comes with it. But every time you do that, you are reducing the potential in the future to create value inside your organization. And so, from our perspective, there needs to be a pretty compelling reason for it to happen. Otherwise, it might be better to sort of keep that asset in-house.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And the only thing I would add is if you're, a founder, CEO negotiating that license with the university, just keep in mind every basis point of that license is going to make its way in a financial model of your potential acquirer. And as they look at gross margins, that's straight off the top line, and that's going to impact the valuation. Some of these contracts, I imagine, are kind of, boilerplate. There may not be a lot of room to negotiate with a large academic hospital or something like that. But I would just say reduce the kind of economic overhang to the maximum extent you can. And similarly, if there's any way to limit the term or the duration of the kind of royalty payments that are owed so that there's at least a path to total freedom for the ultimate acquirer, I think those are the types of things that are going to matter a lot when they're assessing your gross margins and having, an NPV in a model that's going to impact your term sheet. So just encourage you to get the best deal you can.
All right, so we've been focusing a lot on patents, and I think, Leah, you mentioned some other IP rights, but I thought we'd just, give those other IP rights a little bit of time here. Trademarks, copyrights, trade secrets, maybe some of the panel's comments on the value of those in a company. It might depend on the industry, I would think, too.
So I'd love to hear from the funders on the group too, but medical devices, including the one we have, is designed specifically for user-centric design. And so one of the pathways that we've gone down with the final form factor of our device is also protecting it through the design patent pathway. So we have trademarks, design patents, regular patents, MaskWorks, copyrights, and domain names. And part of that is our device is a thing. Every competitor is going to open it up, and they're going to try to copy it. So why not just put a label, if it costs a couple $1,000s, that says, by the way, I protected this.
Over you, Bryan. Trademark important, or?
Sure, yeah, I think trademarks are important, especially when you're gearing up for commercialization. And one thing is, when you file your trademark, it'll usually become public within a few days. It's always important to register your domain name as well as social media that you may use, like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, names, because there are cyber squatters out there that will get them and see your company and try and take them from you beforehand and cause you to spend a lot to get it. So it's better to do that in advance on your checklist.
Yeah. Any comments on the investor side, or?
So one quick comment, actually. The only time so far I've seen IP truly blow up a deal, it was due to trade secret litigation. Okay. And the reason for that for us as an investor was that all of the litigation was being maintained under seal. So the company was not allowed to protect the trade secrets of the party that was alleging the violation. they basically had the ability to have all the court documents and everything under seal, and so the party that was trying to transact the company couldn't share anything about what was going on in the litigation. So it made it impossible for us to really probe and underwrite and kind of, ring fence the risk. And we looked into insurance solutions, and we looked into all sorts of ways to understand it better, but ultimately it ended up being kind of an uncertain, uncapped liability, so we passed for that reason. So I don't know if anyone has advice on how to deal with trade secrets, but it's a category of IP I don't normally think about, but it was the one thing that we could not get comfortable with.
So again, we're commercial stage investors. Most of the time we invest, people have figured out the trademarks. Hopefully they don't have to change their name if they spend a bunch of money marketing their company. But it does raise the question, just topically, about the trade-off between patent protection and disclosure of the invention versus trade secrets. And it is something that you do need to think about early on, right? Because once you file that patent and it publishes, the world can see it. Patent issues, of course, can't do it. But you do really have to think about the relative value, right? I think everybody knows about the old adage that Coke never got patent protection on the formula for Coca-Cola, and they just kept it a trade secret. And so there are some things that you may not want the world to know. And if you do that, of course, trade secret protection, it's actually more complicated than you think. It's fairly straightforward to get right. But you do have to do that analysis relatively early on and think about whether or not you want the world to know how you do what you do.
And a very simple addition in that for trademarks, we like made-up names because it really helps to reduce cost on searching.
Right. Yeah. I just want to comment on the trade secret. That has been a trend that we've seen as a law firm in the medical device space, is the increase in trade secret litigation and trade secret allegations, particularly with former employees that move on from one company to another company. Just seems to be a more sensitive issue now than it was, say, 10 years ago. And so it is something that comes up in due diligence. Where did your employers come from? With that some other competitor, did they potentially bring anything over? So it's something you might want to be prepared to answer in due diligence. So one question I had is, we kind of touched this, how important is it to have an actual issued granted patent? There are tools now in the patent office to get a patent fast. And so I know we touched on this a little bit, but wanted to get your, is an issued patent important, not important? Would you spend another $10,000, $15,000 to try to get an issued patent before diligence? Does it move the needle at all? Any thoughts on that question?
So I'll go first. So again, at the early stage, it's nice to have, but maybe not necessary. I think we'd rather invest in an opportunity that had a well-thought-through filing or application filed, rather than issued IP that either wasn't relevant or wasn't well thought through. And again, that plays in part on again, building the patent portfolio around kind of the foundational patents. So it's helpful, but not necessary.
I think it depends a little bit on how critical the invention is to the operation of your technology, right? So you think about the ability to design around, right? If you think about, so you file a patent in its application and it ultimately doesn't get issued, could you make modifications, still same functionality, and actually get patent protection? If the device fundamentally isn't going to work without the invention disclosed in the application, actually might be worthwhile accelerating the process so you can have that issued patent, and is one thing that an investor can check off their list. Short of that, now in fairness, that doesn't happen all that often, right, when you think about medical devices and engineering. But in that case, I could see an argument for spending the extra money and getting it done. Otherwise, you're probably looking at an entire state of applications and probably making some assessment whether or not there's enough in there that will issue and protect the device.
Where to file is often a question that a startup company has, because it's pretty expensive to file outside the United States, in particular, Japan, Europe, China. So I wanted to get the panel's thought on that. Can you get away just U.S., Europe, and China? Is that enough? Is there some countries that you have to file in? Does that depend on the medical device or the market? So any thoughts on the panel on that?
I can talk about how we figure it out.
Okay.
So we pulled market reports and look at the indications that we're going after and figure out what the prevalence of the type of surgery that we're going after is worldwide, and determine, which countries we file in based on the market reports.
I think it depends. That's the unfortunate answer, right?
Right.
But to a lot of these questions, the answer is it depends. Certainly the U.S., right, just a massive healthcare market. Going to Europe, right, as well. You think about the other markets. Japan, population-wise, not a huge market, but they reimburse very well, so you might decide to go there. A lot of companies are filing in China, not because they necessarily think that they're going to launch in China, although some do. But it is an easy thing when you're looking for non-dilutive funding to grant a license to your IP in China. And so we see that. I don't know that that's strictly necessary from a funding perspective anyway. But it is a strategy that needs to be considered. But there, of course, are tons of countries where it's not particularly important just because the market's not big enough.
Right. Now, one process we've done is go out there and actually look at what the potential acquirers and look at their patent portfolio and look where they filed, and at least try to cover those countries, figuring, they're not going to expect you to file in more countries than they even file in, for example. Any other comments on that topic? But I mean, you're good.
Yeah, so in terms of cost, again, at the early stage, you can start down a path and then realize it's going to be very costly to deliver on it. Again, when working with the right counsel, you'll be able to hopefully understand kind of the schedule of costs associated with filing in whichever geographies you select. So building that in and thinking about that at the early stage, that's an important budget item to have. And then if you stick by it and stick with those geographies.
Yeah, I think I would just add that if I saw an early stage company or even a later stage company pursuing IP in other jurisdictions, it would raise a lot of follow-up questions to me. Not negative questions, but I would ask, so do you have a testing strategy or a clinical study strategy to get the Japanese approval if you're getting IP there, or do you think you'll do it, a non-dilutive transaction? Are you planning on selling off these rights? It would just kind of raise to me the question of what's the OUS strategy and is it cohesive? So I think rather than filing just to file, having a story around how do I think about Japan, how do I think about China, how do I think about CE mark under MDR, like all of those are very big questions that are very important. So I would kind of let the bigger order questions drive what the IP strategy is, as opposed to doing IP just everywhere and then having a different story for, the exit for the company or something like that.
Yeah, it's a business call for sure, but a lot of times we, in pharma or in a drug device combo, you tend to see probably more worldwide protection rather than less. But there's ways to strategize to sort of defer your costs by, with your PCT applications and deferring examination, and great patent attorneys like Rabi can help with that.
Yeah, but I mean, fair to say, United States, Europe, and a pretty decent gap between the next jurisdictions. Okay.
I think that's right.
Okay, cool. So wanted to kind of finish up with some questions about war stories or things that everybody has a fun due diligence story they've had in the past, a deal that blown up or what was the issue. So I thought I'd just kind of throw that out to the panel and let them kind of go through and tell us some fun stories that they've had in IP due diligence. I don't know who wants to go first.
So I'm happy to go first. We could do a whole 40-minute panel on this one. We were part of a syndicate that came together last year that was looking at making a fairly large investment in a medical device company. I mean, it was going to be north of $100 million. And shameless plug for you guys, we hired Knobbe Martin, so being sitting in the front row here, and one of his colleagues helped us with it. It was legitimately a mess. The founder had started work on the invention while she was a grad student at the university, which raises issues around whether or not the university has rights to the invention. And so you have to be careful about that. You have to document it correctly. There was literally zero documentation, so a lot of uncertainty there. And then they went and, so they created an IP holding company and then created a separate company for each indication they were going to pursue with fundamentally the same transaction. Presumably because they were going to raise money from different investors based on the indication. But rather than hiring all the R&D people at the holding company, they had them at each of the operating company levels, and they all did work on fundamentally the same IP. There were no cross-entity agreements regarding who owned what. Several of those companies had been subsequently dissolved. I think one went through bankruptcy. And so there was no clear explanation in terms of who owned it. I can't beat on the get your assignment of inventions right, because a fair number of the inventors had never signed assignment of inventions agreements with the company, so there was lack of clarity there. I think the conclusion was on one of the patents, there was a consultant that actually had the right to practice the patent because there was no assignment of inventions language. These people were all gone. Half of them been fired. The company's gone out of business. There was no way we were going to contact them all and get assignments from them. It was, I was telling Rabi earlier, so I went back and took a look at the deck that Sming put together. It was 62 pages long. If the IP diligence results deck is 62 pages long, there is a fundamental issue. But, and so at the end of the day, then they actually did a really nice job, again, shameless plug for Sping, walking us through the practical risks. But, we think about risk return, right, or risk-adjusted return. And so it impaired what we were willing to bid for the asset, reduced it, not increased it, of course. And we just decided that we weren't willing to take unfettered risk, and the sort of the normal growth stage return was just not enough. And so we reduced what we were willing to pay. As a competitive process, we actually ultimately got outbid and passed on the deal.
So I have a much smaller disaster that I worked with, and this was while I was counsel for an investor. So often very small investments, and this is a couple $1 million investment into an early stage technology company, they bypass paying for IP due diligence entirely. So as a corporate attorney that has an IP lien in my background, I at least checked who owned the IP. For my investor who said that they didn't want to pay for IP due diligence. And as it turns out that the company they were investing in did not own any of the IP. That was the base of the company's product. My client went forward with the deal, and we insisted on a side letter that allowed my client to call their investment funds back within a certain amount of time if the IP hadn't been assigned. And so when the company blew up about 2 years later, in the middle of bankruptcy, et cetera, my client called their investment funds, and so they didn't lose money. They didn't obviously get the investment return, and we're very happy that we had checked an ownership line.
So just a couple that are hopefully encouraging war stories, actually. We had a couple deals where we did one kind of level of IP diligence based on what the company had done up until that point, and maybe paid our attorneys $10,000 or so of work, and basically came back to the company and said, at this point, like, we think that you infringe this, and we're not satisfied, and that's really important for us, so we have to walk. And we try to be helpful and basically say, these are the categories of things that we would do if we were you, to do more work, engage different counsel, et cetera. And in both cases, actually, they took a little bit of financial risk to do a lot more work on IP, in one case with a different counsel, and came back with shockingly positive arguments across non-infringement and validity, all sorts of stuff that was really thoughtful, really comprehensive, and we ultimately did get comfortable and ended up doing both of those deals. So sometimes the quality of work really does matter, and sometimes just the stage of the company, it maybe made sense for them not to invest in those types of things at that stage, but as they migrated to taking institutional capital, it was the right time to do that work. So I say that those not really war stories because they ended up working out well, but there's always a deeper level of work and review, and sometimes those details matter a lot to investors. So,
any final comments? I think we're just a few more, about a minute left. So.
Just briefly, David's stories were great, and I'm glad they went out. They worked out well. We had a similar case where, and we save our IP diligence process till the end of our process once there's a signed term sheet in place. And it didn't work out as well as it sounded for you, where when we had IP counsel take a look, and the technology was interesting, but in a crowded space, there was a novel clinical aspect to it that we really liked, so we pushed forward. And our counsel identified a number of patents that the company's counsel just didn't turn up, and as a result of that, it really killed the deal. So again, very not normal occurrence, but it's expected, and that's why, of course, we do the diligence, but unfortunately it didn't turn out as well.
You can find an answer sometimes, which is great. So, cool. Well, that's the end of our time period. So thank you for attending the panel. We'll be around if there's any follow-up questions. So thank you for attending.